Hello, everyone. Welcome to Rafa and Tennis Talk, where we talk about tennis with a bias towards Rafael Nadal. Today, we will be looking at the US Open 22 men's draw, highlighting popcorn first round matches and making predictions. Obviously, the qualifiers haven't been filled in yet, but we will consider the possibilities of whether a quali can get the upset and give an update if needed once they are filled in. Without further ado, let's get started with Medvedev's quarter. So the chalk matchups for the fourth round here are Medvedev versus RBA and PCB versus FAA. But let's take a look to see if we think those are likely. The two big first round matches that immediately jump out are Kyrgios against Kokkinakis and Thiem against PCB. While these both have the potential to produce some fireworks and great tennis, I think both upset potentials are extremely small. While Kyrgios is capable of losing any match and is also a question mark with an injury, Kokkinakis has won only one main draw match across four hardcourt tournaments since Wimbledon. That one win was against Verdasco, who is a shell of his former self and ranked outside the top 100 right now. Kyrgios will likely win this one in three. PCB is also a bit of an enigma right now, having produced a completely unexpected win in Canada before immediately crashing out in the first round of Cincinnati. But we can likely chalk that up to fatigue, having played 6 days in a row in Canada and only having one day off to travel to Cincinnati before playing a hard fought 3-set match to begin in Cincinnati. I expect he'll be perfectly fine to be able to beat Thiem in 3 sets. Thiem has finally started to string together a couple of wins in his comeback, but they've all been against weaker opponents than PCB, and it's all been on clay. He hasn't even played a hardcourt match since a straight set second round loss to Lloyd Harris in Dubai in March of last year. Other interesting first round matchups are Draper versus Ruusuvuori and Shelton against Aquali. Ruusuvuori has been having some pretty solid results on the hard courts recently, with wins over Hubie and Stan and very close losses to Hubie and Cilic. But I think Draper pulls this one out. He's been playing really well outside of a confusing loss to Huesler and Winston-Salem this week. But he played a phenomenal match against de Minaur at Wimbledon and beat Tsitsipas in straight sets in Canada, led against Monfils before Monfils retired, and then lost to the eventual champion in the quarters. I think this will be a very fun match that Draper takes him for. Shelton burst into the spotlight after taking out Casper fairly easily in Cincinnati and making the decision to go pro leading up to the US Open. With an opening match against a qualifier and a potential second round match against Basilashvili, who has strung two match wins together only once since February, with losses against Van Rijthoven, Rosenkrantz, Munyar, Popyrin, and Jumer, I think Shelton actually has a pretty good shot to make the third round here. As far as the fourth round matchups, I do think we get chalk. I think the most possible upsets to the chalk matchups are de Minaur over PCB in the third and Kyrgios over RBA in the third. But de Minaur hasn't looked good enough in the summer hardcourt swing to expect him to beat PCB, who is coming off a win in Canada, as we mentioned earlier. Kyrgios is a question mark with an injury and hasn't ever made the fourth round at the USO before. I think it's extremely possible he either withdraws or beats himself before the third round matchup with RBA, and RBA isn't an opponent you want to play with an injury, even if he were to make it that far. So I do think we get chalk this whole quarter. I don't think Medvedev will have any trouble with RBA, and I think that FAA prevails in 4 or 5 over PCB. He hasn't looked particularly strong in the hardcourt swing besides a spectacular match against Sinner and Cincy, but he's defending a semifinal appearance here last year, and I think expecting PCB to beat him would be an overreaction to PCB's Canada win. I think FAA pulls this out before falling in 3 or 4 to Medvedev in the quarters. So my projected semifinalist in this quarter is Medvedev. Next, we'll look at Rafa's quarter. So first of all, chalk in this quarter would be Norrie against Rublev and Schwartzman against Nadal in the fourth rounds. Key first round matchups include Sock versus Schwartz and Fognini versus Karatsev. Sock, unfortunately, hasn't looked great in his comeback to the tour. While he did score a big win over Cressy at Wimbledon and beat Goffin, who's been having a decent year in DC, he also has had very convincing losses to Ivashka and Tommy Paul in Cincy qualies in Atlanta. But he does tend to play well in New York and was well on his way to upsetting Zverev last year before he got injured. On the other hand, Schwartzman has been abysmal since the French Open. Clay has always been his preferred surface, and he's not been as good on grass and hard court as he has been on clay, but this year has been baffling. His strongest win since the French has been against Davidovich Fokina, and he has losses against Query, Draper, Brody, Rusevori, and ARV, who is no hardcourt specialist either. So in this matchup, I'm actually going to be bold and pick Sock to score a massive upset to really shake up this quarter. Fognini and Karatsev are both players going cold right now, but I think Fognini has shown a bit more to be excited about in recent weeks, so I'm picking him to take this match before falling easily to Rafa. Also on upset watch is Shapovalov. He finally showed some decent form again in Cincy with wins over Dimitrov and Tommy Paul before giving Medvedev a decent fight. But before that, he was on a terrible skid. After Rome, he went cold and went on a 1-8 streak through Canada, including losses to Ivashka, Rune, Ate, Bonzi, Nakashima, and JJ Wolf. He has a pretty decent draw to make the third, but assuming he does make it there, I don't think he stands a chance against Rublev. I also expect Isner to upset Rune in the second round. Isner made a run to the quarters in Cincy, and Rune has been terrible ever since his quarterfinal run at the French. So, with Schwartzman out, my projected fourth round matches are Tiafoe versus Nadal and Norrie versus Rublev. I know some people may doubt Nadal as he's only played one match since pulling out of Wimbledon with an injury, and he lost that one match that he did play, but I think we have to put that into perspective. First of all, if you actually watch the match between Nadal and Coric, he looked fine. He was serving in the 120s consistently and did not look hampered by the injury at all. Also, while he did lose to a qualifier in the second round, that qualifier also went on to win the tournament. And the set Nadal took off him in the second set of their match was the only set he lost the entire tournament. Also, Nadal was one shot away from potentially beating him in straight sets. He had a swinging volley set up for him on his set point in the first set tiebreak. He bricked the shot and ended up losing the tiebreak before winning the second. But if he makes that shot and everything else happens the same, he wins in straight sets. And he's had more time to practice and will be able to play himself into form against early, easy matchups. So I think he'll be more than fine by the fourth round. I don't see Foe troubling him, and I think he gets into the quarters with maybe only one set lost along the way. I also don't see Rublev giving any trouble to Norrie. Norrie played really well in both Canada and Cincy, and Rublev has been on a cold streak, with Cressy being his only top 50 wins since the French. I also think Norrie won't have anything to trouble Rafa, so Rafa is my projected semifinalist from this quarter. Next, we'll look at what I think is the craziest quarter of the draw, which is Alcaraz's quarter. This quarter, I think, has the most potential to give us a first-time Slam semifinalist. Chalk matchups in the fourth round would be Hubie versus Sinner and Cilic versus Alcaraz. Even if we only looked at these chalk matchups, Sinner and Alcaraz would both be first-time Slam semifinalists. But I think there's a ton of upset potential. First things first, our potential popcorn matches in the first round in this quarter are Goffin versus Musetti, Dimitrov versus Johnson, and Baez versus Alcaraz. Both Goffin and Musetti have had pretty decent years by their standards, especially Musetti with a win in Hamburg for his first ATP Tour title and a 500 at that, but have struggled mightily on hard courts. Both have a losing record on hard courts this year, and neither got much hard court practice before the US Open due to those early losses. I think this matchup is a complete toss-up, but I'll give it to the youngster. Dimitrov looked like he may have been coming back into form on clay this year with the semifinal run in Monte Carlo and a great match that he just barely lost against Tsitsipas in Rome, but he's been struggling with injuries ever since the French. Steve Johnson, a former top 25 player, has been having a decent year that could see him get back into the top 100, but if Dimitrov were healthy, I'd have him winning this one in straights. But he's not, so just like Wimbledon's first round, I give this one to Johnson. Alcaraz is everyone's favorite rising star this year, with Masters wins in both Miami and Madrid, but I'm not as high on him as everyone else is, and despite being in the top 3 favorites for almost every tournament since Madrid, his results since then have been disappointing. He hasn't won a tournament at any level since then, and his slam performances have been the third round at the Aussie, quarters at the French, and fourth round at Wimbledon. Very impressive for a 19-year-old, no doubt, but not living up to the astronomically high expectations that people have for him. That being said, Baez has been more the guy who produces fireworks and losses rather than the guy actually getting the big upsets, so I still give this one to Alcaraz in straight sets. Now, on to the big upset alerts I think are in this quarter. Coric is in Alcaraz's part of the draw, and I am prone to overreacting to Coric's win in Cincinnati, given how convincing it was and how he is a former number 12 in the world that had only dropped so far in the rankings due to an injury. So I actually am projecting Coric to upset Alcaraz in the third round. I also believe Hubie and Cilic are both also vulnerable, though I don't really see anyone in their sections being good enough to capitalize on that. So my projected fourth round matches are Hubie against Sinner and Cilic against Coric. I think Sinner beats Hubie and Coric gets another big upset over Cilic before finally falling to Sinner. So Sinner is my projected semifinalist from this quarter. Finally, we'll look at the fourth quarter, which is Tsitsipas's quarter. Chalk in Tsitsipas's quarter would be Tsitsipas against Berrettini and Ruud against Fritz. Popcorn matches in this quarter are Murray versus Cerundolo and Nishioka versus Davidovich Fokina. Murray has been slowly improving in form this year with a final in Stuttgart on the grass and some impressive wins here and there. Unfortunately, he is still nowhere near what he used to be. His opponent, however, is a clay court specialist with only 10 career matches on hard court, coming in at an even 5-5. However, all 5 of those wins came in Miami, which included retirements from Opelka and Sinner. So he has never won a hard court match outside of Miami, including first round losses at both US Open tune up events in Canada and Cincinnati. So I'm actually going to pick Murray to pull the upset out on this one, and he actually has a solid shot to make the third round too. Davidovich Fokina is also a clay court specialist with a record of just 4-10 on hard courts this year, with only one of those 4 wins coming against someone in the top 100, which was a win against Dan Evans. Nishioka, on the other hand, had an impressive run to the finals in DC, losing to Kyrgios in the finals, and gave FAA a solid fight in Canada. So despite ADF's solid results this year, since they've all been on clay, I'm going to give this one to Nishioka. Other potential upsets are Korda over Paul in the second round, and Korda or Paul over Ruud in the third. Korda has had a couple of strong wins over the past few weeks, but also a couple of head-scratching losses. Paul has been playing the best tennis of his life and is seeded in a slam for the first time in his career. Korda has a lot of potential, but I think Paul takes this one right now. Casper was on a tear after Wimbledon, winning Gstaad and making a deep run in Canada with wins over RBA and FAA. But then, inexplicably, up a set and up 40 love on serve in the second set against Hubie in the semis, he crashed and burned, made a ton of errors to gift that service game, and continued playing horribly for the rest of the match to give Hubie an easy win. He continued that same horrible level of play to get beat comfortably by Shelton in the second round of Cincy after a first round bye. He's one of my favorites, so I hope he gets things back together, but if he doesn't, he could have trouble even making the third to play Paul, with a first round against a former top 20 player and Slam semifinalist who's trying to make a comeback, and a second round match potentially against Van Rijthoven, who collected quite a few scalps in the grass season this year. If Ruud does make it to the third, I unfortunately will have to give Paul the upset over him. So my projected fourth round matches are Tsitsipas against Berrettini and Fritz against Paul. The Tsitsipas Berrettini match is hard to call. Tsitsipas crashed out of Canada in the second round against Draper after a first round bye, but then followed that performance up with a run to the finals in Cincinnati, including a win over Medvedev. But he has always performed poorly at the US Open, with his third round performance last year being his best result there. But Berrettini has also performed poorly recently, losing in his second round matches at both Canada and Cincy after first round byes in both. So while I had Berrettini as my third favorite to win the whole tournament before Canada, I'm actually going to pick Tsitsipas to win this one to make his first US Open quarterfinal. After dealing with an injury and an extremely tough loss to Rafa at Wimbledon, Fritz wasn't ready for the conditions in DC and had to retire from his first match of the summer hardcourt swing. but he followed it up with a decent performance in Canada and a great performance in Cincy, beating both Kyrgios and Rublev before taking Medvedev to the wire in the first set of the quarters. Paul has been playing really well recently, but I don't think he'll have enough to beat Fritz. So I'm picking Fritz to not only make his second consecutive Slam quarterfinal, but also to beat Tsitsipas in the quarters to make his first ever Slam semifinal. So now my projected semifinals are set at Medvedev versus Fritz and Nadal versus Sinner. Despite Fritz's great results this year, including his first quarterfinal in a Slam at Wimbledon and his first Masters title at Indian Wells this year, I do think Medvedev takes this one in 4. I also like Sinner a lot, and I think he was one set away from upsetting Djokovic at Wimbledon, which could have led to his first Slam semifinal, final, and maybe even first Slam win, considering Djokovic did win it. But I don't think he's going to be good enough on hard courts to beat Nadal, and I have Nadal also taking his match in 4 sets. And finally, a rematch of the 2019 US Open final and the Australian Open final from earlier this year. Everyone will probably think I'm biased, which I am, but I'm picking Rafa to beat Medvedev in the final in 4 or 5 sets. I think not only does Nadal have the perfect game to beat Medvedev, which is why he's 5-1 against him in the head-to-head, but he also has a massive mental edge. Medvedev fought back in their US Open final in 2019 from 2-0 down to force a fifth and had all the momentum and looked like he was ready to break early and cruise to a win in the fifth before Nadal fought back and never looked back. They played a few months later in the ATP finals, and Medvedev led 5-1 and loved 30 in the deciding set before Nadal fought back, held, and went on to force a tiebreaker, which he won. And Medvedev led Nadal 2-0 in Australia this year and had a love 40 lead in one of Nadal's service games early in the third set before Nadal again fought back, held that game, won the third, and went on to win that match as well. Those mental scars aren't going to be easy to overcome, and it gives Nadal a massive advantage. So I do think Rafa takes it to get his record extending 23rd Slam and his record tying 5th US Open title. So, let me know in the comments what you all think. Am I crazy for picking Rafa? Who is everyone else picking?